When I do these YouTube videos and when I write the occasional article or blog post and so on, I try to say something as original as possible. I try not to say the same thing that lots of other people are saying, that seemingly all other commentators out there are saying. And when I can't say something totally original, I try to put a spin on it or take a perspective on it that, again, not that many other people are taking. So in response to the horrific attacks on police officers, massacre of police officers that took place in Dallas last week, I'm not going to spend too much time saying what I think should go without saying, namely that this was a horrific atrocity, totally unjustified, completely inexcusable, utterly reprehensible, and just completely outside of the pale of civilized behavior or legitimate resistance to police injustice and police brutality. Rather, I would like to focus on one element of this whole situation, or rather, the popular response to it that I think isn't getting quite as much attention as it deserves. The whole phenomenon of guilt by association in public and especially political discourse. As soon as I heard the news of what happened in Dallas, my maybe second or third reaction was, oh boy. It's only a matter of time before defenders of police and members of the police lobby themselves begin blaming this crime on the Black Lives Matter movement. I was not disappointed. I can't tell you how many times I've seen different pro-police advocates blaming this attack on Black Lives Matter. They'll point to incidents like that incident maybe a year and a half or so ago in which Black Lives Matter protesters at one particular demonstration were heard chanting, "What do we want? Dead cops. When do we want it? Now." They usually like to point to that particular incident to try to support this narrative that criticism of police and condemnation of police brutality, particularly as expressed by the Black Lives Matter movement, somehow make crimes like what happened in Dallas attributable to that movement. The suggestion seems to be, don't ever complain about what police do. Don't protest against police injustice or police brutality, because in so doing, you are creating a climate of rhetoric that foments hatred toward the police, and that in turn can lead lone wolves or groups to commit acts like what happened in Dallas last week. In a nutshell, I don't buy it. I think that individuals who are willing to go out of their way to plan and execute these kinds of reprehensible attacks are fully responsible for them. Even if they might hear certain anti-police rhetoric and agree with it, at the end of the day, they are the ones who choose to act on it. And I don't believe that someone who is so full of hatred for police that he would actually be willing to carry out an attack like the Dallas attack would not have carried out the attack if it were not for a lot of that supposed anti-police rhetoric. I'm not convinced that said rhetoric, coming from sources like Black Lives Matter, is a but-for cause, as we put it in the field of law, of those kinds of attacks. But I also want to say, it's interesting to hear a lot of folks on the left speaking out against this particular smear by association. A lot of them are denying strenuously and correctly that Black Lives Matter is to blame for this attack. But think about it. This is exactly the same tactic that folks on the left all too often use whenever there's a gun massacre in a different context. I remember after, I think, Jared Lee Loughner carried out the assault in Arizona back in 2011, in which Gabrielle Giffords, the congresswoman, was injured. A lot of folks came out and blamed the Tea Party and rhetoric coming from right-wing sources, particularly people like Sarah Palin, for that massacre. They suggested that that climate of hatred or hateful rhetoric somehow made those attacks more likely, or made them possible. From what I remember reading at the time, it turned out that Jared Lee Loughner didn't really have any political ideology at all, one way or the other. And there was no evidence that he had any political motives whatsoever for carrying out the attack. In addition to that, there was no evidence, if I remember correctly, that he had even heard or been exposed to any of the insidious rhetoric coming from the political right, whether from the Tea Party, whether from specific political figures like Sarah Palin with her "don't retreat, reload" rhetoric, whatever the case might be. So it's hard to see how that rhetoric could really have been to blame for that massacre. That, of course, was far from the first time that folks on the left have resorted to that guilt by association tactic. It goes back even more than half a century. After John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, people all over the political left in the United States immediately leapt to blame the admittedly very real climate of hatred and prejudice and political extremism, right-wing political extremism, that was rife in Dallas County in those days. A man, Lee Harvey Oswald, who had actually flirted with Marxist-Leninist ideology, assassinated the President of the United States. And yes, I'm familiar with all the conspiracy theories, and I used to believe in some of them, but I no longer do. That's a conversation for another day. Basically, here you had an assassin who had actually flirted with extreme left-wing radical ideology, assassinated President Kennedy. Frankly, from what I've read about Lee Harvey Oswald, he probably was apolitical in his motives for assassinating the president. He probably wanted notoriety and wanted to make his mark on history, even by committing such a foul act. Whatever ideological dalliances he had with communism probably didn't even play a meaningful role in his assassination of President Kennedy. But either way, it made no sense then, and it still makes no sense today, to blame that assassination on right-wing political extremism, as real and as rife as that extremism was, especially in the Dallas area, especially back in that era. Guess what, ladies and gentlemen? The same thing goes when the shoe is on the other ideological foot. Just as it made no sense for the liberal bien-pensants of the early 1960s to blame the assassination of John F. Kennedy on right-wing political extremism and hateful rhetoric, given the motives of the actual assassin who pulled the trigger, in the same way it makes no sense for right-wingers today, half a century later, to blame an attack like the one in Dallas on members of the Black Lives Matter movement. People across the political spectrum could really stand a good sturdy dose of belief in personal responsibility, as well as thinking critically about and critically examining the issue of causation in these cases. People need to stop rushing to judgment in these cases and blaming certain acts on certain forms of rhetoric or certain ideologies, especially when you consider that most adherents of those ideologies or most subscribers to that rhetoric don't go out and commit these kinds of acts and don't condone them either. I can certainly understand if a lot of folks on the right feel tempted to give their opponents on the left a little taste of their own medicine and apply the same guilt by association smear tactic to them. But at the end of the day, two wrongs don't make a right. And more importantly, if guilt by association makes no sense and is not factually accurate in cases where there's no evidence that an individual assassin or mass murderer was directly motivated in a but-for sense by the rhetoric that's floating around in the public square out there, then it makes no more sense to apply that guilt by association tactic when it's directed at folks on the left. We all need to make up our minds. Do we believe in guilt by association or don't we? And if you do, don't start to complain when it's directed at you. You shouldn't engage in that tactic at all in the first place without recognizing that two can play at that game. Indeed, many can play at that game. So I think folks on the right and left alike need to decide whether they believe in guilt by association across the board, pick a position on that issue, and stick with it. I've chosen my position. I don't believe in that kind of guilt by association. If there's no evidence that a particular attacker or a particular murderer would not have committed that atrocity in a particular case, were it not for a certain climate of rhetoric, and if there's no indication that that individual was directly caused to carry out the attack by said rhetoric, then I don't think it makes sense to draw a causal link between the two. But it doesn't make sense when it can be used to make one wing of the political spectrum look bad, and yet somehow not make sense when it's used to try to make folks on the other wing of the spectrum look bad. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Either it's good for everyone or it's good for no one. Make up your minds.